There are things that should only exist in dreams, or perhaps in stories told around campfires when the night grows too quiet and the shadows too long. Margaret Hayes had heard plenty of those stories growing up in Austin. Tales of the wild lands down south where civilization ended and something older began, but she never imagined she would become part of one herself. At 31 years old, she considered herself practical, grounded in reality, a woman who made decisions based on spreadsheets and soil reports, not folklore and superstition. The ranch she inherited from her uncle Theodore was supposed to be a fresh start after the divorce, a place where she could rebuild her life away from the judgmental whispers of the city, away from David's new family that seemed to replace her so easily, away from everything that reminded her of the life she thought she would have. The property sat on 2,000 acres of South Texas wilderness, just 40 miles north of the Mexican border, where the land was harsh and unforgiving, where summers could kill the unprepared, and winters brought their own brand of cruelty. Uncle Theodore had lived there alone for 27 years, managing cattle and keeping to himself, rarely visiting family, rarely letting anyone visit him, and when he died suddenly of a heart attack at 68, Margaret was surprised to learn she was his sole heir. The lawyer explained that Theodore had been quite specific in his will, wanting the land to stay in the family, wanting someone who would respect what he had built, and apparently, Margaret was the only relative he trusted with that responsibility. She drove down on a Tuesday morning in early September, her SUV packed with everything she owned that mattered, which turned out to be less than she expected. The highway gave way to county roads, then to dirt paths, and finally to a single track that wound through mesquite and prickly pear, through country that looked like it had never heard of the 21st century. The ranch house appeared suddenly around a bend, a low structure of stone and weathered wood that seemed to grow out of the landscape itself, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings in various states of repair. Margaret parked in front of the main house and sat for a moment, taking it all in, feeling the weight of isolation settle over her like a physical thing. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away according to the lawyer, and the nearest town, a place called Esperanza with a population of 342, was 23 miles of rough road. This was what she wanted, though. Distance from everything and everyone. Space to figure out who Margaret Hayes was supposed to be, now that she was no longer David's wife, no longer part of the life they had built together in the suburbs. She spent the first 3 days cleaning, organizing, making the house livable. Theodore had been neat but sparse, a man who owned what he needed and nothing more. The furniture was functional, the kitchen supplied with basics, the shelves lined with books about ranching, weather patterns, animal behavior, and surprisingly, several volumes on Native American history of the region and the wildlife of northern Mexico. Margaret found journals too, dozens of them, Theodore's handwriting filling page after page with observations about the land, the animals, the changing seasons, notes that read more like the work of a naturalist than a rancher. On the 4th day, she decided to explore the property. Theodore's old Ford truck started on the 3rd try, and she drove along the fence lines, checking the condition of the posts and wire, making mental notes of repairs that would need doing before she could think about bringing in cattle. The land was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, rolling hills covered in tough grasses and scattered trees, dry creek beds that would only run during the brief rainy season, and everywhere the signs of animals, deer tracks, javelina droppings, the distinctive prints of coyotes, and once, something larger that she could not identify, a paw print the size of her hand pressed deep into the mud near a stock tank. She took a photo of it with her phone, thinking she would look it up later, but something about the print made her uneasy. Something about the depth and clarity of it suggesting a weight and power that did not fit with any animal she knew should be in this area. That night, Margaret sat on the porch as the sun went down, watching the sky turn from blue to gold to deep purple, and that was when she heard it for the first time, a sound that made every muscle in her body lock tight, a deep, coughing roar that echoed across the hills, unmistakable and impossible. Jaguars were extinct in this part of Texas, had been gone for 50 years according to everything she had read. Occasional sightings near the border, but nothing confirmed, nothing this far north. Yet she knew that sound, had heard it in documentaries, In nature programs, the distinctive vocalization of a big cat asserting its territory. Margaret went inside and locked the doors, feeling foolish even as she did it, knowing that if something that size wanted to get in, a lock would not stop it. She pulled out her laptop and searched for recent jaguar sightings in South Texas, finding only a handful of reports from the border region, none confirmed, all dismissed as misidentifications or exaggerations. But the sound came again 2 hours later, closer this time, and Margaret stood at the window, peering out into the darkness, seeing nothing but knowing something was out there, something that should not exist in this time and place. Sleep did not come easy that night, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of golden eyes and shadows that moved with deadly purpose. The next morning, Margaret decided to check the perimeter cameras that Theodore had installed around the property. The lawyer mentioned them, part of the security system, motion activated to catch any intruders or predators that might threaten the livestock. She found the control box in Theodore's office, a small room off the main bedroom that she had not fully explored yet, and powered up the system. The footage from the previous night loaded slowly, 12 different camera angles covering the approaches to the house and the main corrals, and Margaret fast-forwarded through hours of nothing, just static images of empty landscape lit by infrared, until suddenly there was movement on camera 7, the one facing the stock tank where she had seen the large paw print. The jaguar moved into frame like liquid shadow, massive and undeniable, the spotted coat clear even in the black and white footage. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she watched the animal approach the water, drink deeply, then raise its head and look directly at the camera, as if it knew it was being watched, as if it wanted to be seen. The footage continued for 3 more minutes, the jaguar circling the tank, marking territory, displaying the confident movements of an apex predator that feared nothing, and then it vanished back into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared. Margaret replayed the footage 5 times, each viewing confirming what her rational mind wanted to deny. There was a jaguar on her property, a healthy adult specimen that had no business existing here, and if there was one, there might be more. She spent the rest of the morning going through Theodore's journals more carefully, looking for any mention of big cats, of unusual wildlife, of anything that might explain what she was seeing, and she found it on a page dated 3 years earlier, an entry that made her stop cold. Theodore wrote about seeing his first jaguar near the southern boundary of the property, describing his shock and wonder, explaining how he had researched and discovered that a small population had apparently re-established itself in the borderlands, migrating up from Mexico through wildlife corridors that still existed despite human development. He wrote about his decision to keep this knowledge secret, fearing that if word got out, the wrong people would come, hunters or scientists or curiosity seekers who would disrupt the delicate balance, who would threaten the animals or turn his ranch into a spectacle. Over the following pages, Theodore documented more sightings, dozens of them, describing individual animals by their spot patterns, noting behaviors, tracking movements, and the entries took on an almost obsessive quality, as if the jaguars had become the central focus of his life. But it was an entry from 8 months before his death that struck Margaret most profoundly. Theodore wrote about encountering a man in the far southwestern section of the property, a man who moved through the wilderness like he belonged there, who seemed to exist in harmony with the land in a way Theodore had never seen, and most remarkably, who appeared to live among the jaguars without fear. Theodore described watching from a distance as this man sat calmly while 2 adult jaguars lounged nearby, as comfortable with his presence as house cats with their owner, and the man had noticed Theodore watching, had met his eyes across 100 yards of scrubland, and somehow communicated without words that this secret needed to remain undiscovered. The entry ended with Theodore writing that he had left supplies at a specific location, marked on a hand-drawn map, and that he would continue to do so, understanding that some mysteries were better observed than solved, some lives better left undisturbed. Margaret stared at the map sketched in the margin of the journal page, orienting herself to the landmarks she had already learned. The location was deep in the southwestern quadrant of the property, near a series of limestone caves that Theodore had mentioned in earlier entries, and Margaret felt a pull toward that place, a need to understand what was happening on her land, to see with her own eyes if this man truly existed, or if Theodore's isolation had finally broken something in his mind. She packed supplies in the truck the next morning: water, food, binoculars, Theodore's detailed maps, and a rifle she found in the gun safe, though she had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. The drive to the southwestern section took over an hour, the terrain growing rougher as she went, the track deteriorating until she was forced to park and continue on foot. Margaret had done plenty of hiking in her younger years, but this was different. This was wilderness that did not care about her presence, that would not yield or accommodate, and she moved carefully, watching where she placed each step, scanning constantly for movement in the brush. The caves appeared after 2 miles of walking, dark openings in a limestone bluff that rose 30 feet above the surrounding terrain, and scattered around the base of the bluff were signs of habitation: a fire ring with recent ashes, a lean-to structure built against the rock face, supplies stored in waterproof containers, and most startling, jaguar tracks everywhere, overlapping and fresh, suggesting multiple animals visiting this place regularly. Margaret approached slowly, calling out a greeting that echoed off the stone and vanished into the vastness. And when no response came, she moved closer, examining the camp with growing fascination. This was someone's home, simple but functional, supplied with everything needed for long-term survival: books stacked inside the lean-to, journals similar to Theodore's, tools maintained with obvious care, and everywhere evidence of coexistence with animals that should have made human habitation impossible. She was examining a collection of sketches, detailed drawings of jaguars in various poses, when she heard the voice behind her, low and calm, but carrying an edge of warning. The man stood 20 feet away, having appeared without a sound, and Margaret's first thought was that he looked like he belonged to the landscape itself: sun-darkened skin, lean build suggesting strength rather than bulk, dark hair grown long and tied back, wearing clothes that were practical and worn, a knife at his belt that was clearly a tool rather than a weapon. His age was difficult to determine, somewhere between 35 and 45, his face weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes were the most striking feature, dark and measuring, eyes that had seen things Margaret could only imagine, eyes that showed no fear even though she was the one holding the rifle. He spoke first, his voice rough from lack of use but clear, asking if she was Theodore's niece, asking if the old man had finally passed, and when Margaret nodded, she saw something flicker across his face: grief, perhaps, or the acknowledgement of loss. He introduced himself as Samuel. No last name offered, no explanation of how he came to be living in caves on private property in South Texas. And when Margaret asked the obvious questions, he simply said that some stories were longer than an afternoon could hold, but that Theodore had understood, and she might too if she was willing to listen. Margaret lowered the rifle, suddenly feeling foolish for bringing it, and said she wanted to understand, wanted to know what was happening on her land, wanted to know if she should be terrified or amazed by what she was discovering. Samuel smiled at that, a brief expression that transformed his face, and he said that terror and amazement often lived in the same moment, that the line between them was thinner than people imagined. And then he gestured toward the fire ring and asked if she wanted coffee, because his story, and the truth about the jaguars, would take some time to tell properly. They sat on rocks around the cold fire pit, and Samuel began to talk, his words coming slowly at first, then gaining momentum, as if he was unlocking something that had been held silent too long. He told Margaret that he had come to this region 8 years ago, running from a life that had collapsed in ways too painful to detail, seeking isolation and perhaps death in a landscape that did not suffer fools. He told her about his first weeks surviving in the wilderness, learning what could be eaten and what would kill, finding water, making shelter, slowly adapting to a life stripped of everything except the fundamental requirements of existence, and how that simplicity had begun to heal something broken inside him. Before Margaret could fully process everything Samuel was sharing, a sound interrupted them, the same coughing roar she had heard that first night, but much closer now, resonating off the limestone bluff with enough force to feel it in her chest. Samuel did not react with alarm, merely glanced toward the largest cave opening and made a soft clicking sound with his tongue, a signal of some kind, and Margaret watched in disbelief as a massive jaguar emerged from the darkness, moving with that peculiar grace that big cats possess, all coiled power and liquid movement. The animal's coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, the rosettes distinct and beautiful, and its eyes, those impossible golden eyes, fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. Samuel spoke quietly, telling her not to move, not to show fear, that the animal was merely curious, assessing whether she represented a threat or something neutral, and Margaret remained frozen, every instinct screaming at her to run while her rational mind understood that running would trigger the chase instinct, would transform her from observer to prey in a heartbeat. The jaguar approached to within 10 feet, its massive head lowering as it scented the air, reading information that Margaret could not even imagine, and then Samuel made another sound, something between a purr and a growl, and the animal's attention shifted to him. What happened next would stay with Margaret for the rest of her life. Samuel stood slowly and walked toward the jaguar, closing the distance with confident steps, and the animal did not tense or prepare to spring, instead moving to meet him halfway, and Samuel placed his hand on the jaguar's head, scratching behind its ears the way someone might pet a dog, and the great cat leaned into the touch, making a rumbling sound deep in its chest that could have been purring scaled up to terrifying proportions. Samuel looked back at Margaret, his expression serious, and said that trust like this was not given easily, that it had taken months of careful interaction, of learning the animal's language, of proving himself safe through consistent behavior and respect for their nature. And even now, he never assumed complete safety, never forgot what these animals were capable of, never mistook acceptance for domestication. The jaguar that Samuel called Luna, for the crescent marking on her shoulder, stayed for perhaps 15 minutes, allowing Samuel to check her coat for injuries, examining a healing scratch on her flank that he said came from a territorial dispute with another female, and then she simply turned and melted back into the cave opening, her departure as silent as her arrival. Margaret realized she had been holding her breath and let it out in a shaky exhale, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, though Samuel pointed out that she had never truly been in danger, that Luna had assessed her as neutral within the first 30 seconds, that the rest was merely curiosity. He continued his story, explaining how his relationship with the jaguars had developed gradually, how the first encounters were brief and distant, how he learned to read their signals and respect their boundaries, how over months and years a form of communication emerged that was not quite friendship, but something beyond simple coexistence. He told Margaret about the 3 adults that currently used this area as part of their territory, Luna and 2 males he called Ghost and Smoke, and about the complex social dynamics between them, the territorial disputes and mating rituals, the hunting patterns and preferred prey, knowledge accumulated through thousands of hours of observation, knowledge that would make any wildlife biologist jealous. Samuel explained that Theodore had discovered him 2 years after he first arrived, had watched from a distance for weeks before making contact, and instead of reporting him to authorities or demanding he leave, Theodore had offered a different arrangement, quiet support in exchange for protection of the jaguars and the land they needed. Samuel had agreed, understanding that Theodore's motivation came from a deep respect for the natural world, a desire to preserve something wild and magnificent in a landscape increasingly dominated by human concerns. And they had maintained that arrangement until Theodore's death, each man respecting the other's need for solitude while acknowledging their shared purpose. Margaret asked the question that had been building since she first saw the cave paintings, the detailed sketches, the careful notes. Why Samuel did this? What kept him here year after year in conditions that most people would find unbearable? And his answer was both simple and profound. He said that the jaguars had given him something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of purpose that existed outside human judgment and expectation, a connection to something ancient and true, a daily reminder that life could be lived on terms other than those society dictated, and in protecting them, in documenting their existence, in ensuring their survival against the odds. He had found a reason to survive himself when survival had once seemed like more burden than gift. The sun was dropping toward the horizon when Samuel finished talking, the shadows growing long across the scrubland, and Margaret realized she needed to make a decision about what happened next. She could report everything she had discovered, bring in wildlife authorities and researchers, turn her inheritance into a research station or preserve, but that would end Samuel's solitary life and likely drive the jaguars away or worse. She could demand that Samuel leave, assert her rights as landowner, reclaim that section of the property for her own use, but that felt wrong in ways she could not fully articulate, like destroying something precious for the sake of conventional ownership. Or she could do what Theodore had done, accept the strange reality she had discovered, support it quietly, and protect it fiercely from outside interference. The choice should have been difficult, but Margaret found it surprisingly easy, perhaps because her own life had been disrupted and reformed by circumstances beyond her control, perhaps because she understood at a fundamental level what it meant to need isolation and reinvention, or perhaps simply because some things once seen could not be unseen or ignored without betraying something essential in oneself. She told Samuel that she would honor Theodore's arrangement, that she would provide the support her uncle had given, that the southwestern section of the property was his to use as needed, and in return, she wanted to learn, to understand, to occasionally visit and witness the miracle of what existed here. Samuel studied her face for a long moment, perhaps assessing her sincerity, perhaps weighing his options, and then he nodded once, a gesture of acceptance and agreement, and Margaret felt something settle inside her, a sense that she had made the right choice even if it was not the rational one. She made her way back to the truck as darkness fell, using a flashlight to navigate the rough terrain, and when she looked back from a ridge, she could see a small fire burning near the caves, a pinpoint of light in the vast darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, 3 jaguars moved through their territory, apex predators existing against all odds in a world that had supposedly eliminated them decades ago. The following weeks established a new routine for Margaret, days spent working on the ranch, repairing fences and outbuildings, beginning to understand the rhythms of the land and the challenges Theodore had managed alone for so many years. And every 5 or 6 days, she would make the drive to the southwestern section, bringing supplies for Samuel, spending a few hours learning about the jaguars, watching from careful distances as the animals went about their lives, beginning to recognize individuals by their markings and behaviors. Samuel was a patient teacher, pointing out signs she would have missed, explaining the meaning of territorial markings, describing hunting strategies with the detail of someone who had witnessed them countless times. And gradually, Margaret began to see the landscape differently, not as empty wilderness, but as territory filled with purpose and meaning, every creek bed and ridge and dense thicket, part of an intricate system that sustained life she was only beginning to comprehend. Luna became the jaguar Margaret saw most often, the female apparently more tolerant of human presence than the males, and there were afternoons when the great cat would lounge on a rocky outcrop while Margaret and Samuel talked nearby, close enough that Margaret could see the muscles shifting under the spotted coat, close enough to appreciate the absolute power contained in that deceptively relaxed form. Samuel explained that Luna was approximately 6 years old, in her prime, and had successfully raised 2 litters during the time he had been observing, though only 3 cubs from those litters had survived to disperse and seek their own territories, the harsh reality of wildlife claiming the others through disease, accidents, or competition with other predators. Ghost, the larger of the 2 males, remained more elusive, a massive animal that Samuel estimated at close to 200 pounds, with a temperament that was less predictable than Luna's, more prone to aggressive displays and territorial behavior, and Samuel advised keeping greater distance when Ghost was near, respecting the animal's need for space. Smoke was younger, perhaps 4 years old, still establishing himself, sometimes challenging Ghost's dominance, but not yet ready to claim the territory fully, and his interactions with Samuel showed a curious mixture of caution and boldness, approaching closer than Ghost ever did but always ready to retreat at the first sign of anything unexpected. Margaret found herself thinking about the jaguars constantly, even when back at the ranch house working on mundane tasks, her mind returning to those golden eyes and the privilege of witnessing something so few people would ever see. And she understood now what had captured Theodore's fascination, what had reordered his priorities and his life around protecting this secret. 3 months after discovering Samuel's camp, Margaret encountered her first serious threat to the arrangement they had established. A knock on her door that turned out to be Marcus Thornton, the largest landowner in the county aside from her own property. A man in his early 50s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, dressed expensively casual and wearing a smile that did not reach his eyes. He introduced himself politely, offered condolences about Theodore's passing that sounded rehearsed, and then got to the point with admirable directness. He wanted to buy her property, was prepared to make a generous offer, significantly above market value, motivated by his desire to consolidate the ranch lands in this region into a more efficient operation. Margaret thanked him for the offer and declined just as directly, explaining that she had no intention of selling, that she was committed to making a life here and honoring Theodore's legacy. Thornton's smile tightened slightly, and he said that Theodore had been equally stubborn, equally resistant to the obvious benefits of consolidation, but that surely a young woman alone would recognize the challenges of managing a property this size, the difficulties and dangers, the isolation and hard work. And wouldn't it make more sense to take a generous payout and return to civilization? Margaret felt her own smile harden as she repeated her refusal, noting the subtle shift in his tone from friendly offer to veiled pressure, and Thornton stood, adjusting his expensive belt buckle, and said that he hoped she would reconsider, that sometimes people did not understand what they were refusing until circumstances helped clarify matters, that Theodore had been lucky to avoid serious problems, but luck had a way of running out. The threat was implicit but unmistakable, and after Thornton left, Margaret stood on her porch for a long time, watching the dust from his truck settle, understanding that she had just made a powerful enemy, wondering what form his clarification might take. She mentioned the encounter to Samuel on her next visit, and his reaction was immediate and serious, his face darkening as she described Thornton's barely veiled threats. Samuel said that Theodore had dealt with pressure from Thornton for years, that the man saw this property as the final piece in building a ranch empire that would dominate the region, and more importantly, Samuel believed Thornton was aware of the jaguar population, had perhaps been searching for evidence to expose Theodore's illegal protection of endangered species as a way to force a federal seizure of the land. If Thornton could prove jaguars existed here without proper permits and oversight, he could trigger investigations that would tie up the property in legal complications for years, potentially forcing a sale just to resolve the resulting mess. And Samuel's presence as an undocumented resident of private land would only complicate matters further. Margaret asked what Theodore had done to counter Thornton's pressure, and Samuel described a careful balance. Theodore had maintained meticulous records of his ranching operations, documented his land stewardship practices, ensured that everything about his management was beyond legal reproach, making it difficult for Thornton to find leverage. But he had also quietly gathered information about Thornton's less ethical business practices, creating a mutually assured destruction scenario where either man could damage the other if pushed too far. Theodore's death had eliminated that balance, and Thornton was clearly testing to see if Margaret would be as resilient or as prepared as her uncle had been. The conversation left Margaret troubled, but also determined. She would not be pushed off land that was rightfully hers, would not allow threats and pressure to dictate her choices, and she began taking steps to protect herself and the secrets she now shared with Samuel. She met with lawyers, ensured all her ownership documentation was perfect, established relationships with local authorities so they knew her and saw her as a legitimate operator, and she started her own quiet investigation into Thornton's business practices, discovering a pattern of aggressive expansion, properties acquired under questionable circumstances, neighbors who had sold after experiencing mysterious problems with their operations. Margaret was documenting everything, building her own insurance policy, when the first incident occurred 2 weeks after Thornton's visit. She woke one morning to discover someone had cut a section of her fence during the night, allowing nearly 40 head of her newly acquired cattle to wander onto the county road, creating a dangerous situation that took her and 3 hired hands most of the day to resolve. There was no proof of who had done it, but the deliberate nature of the damage, the precise location chosen to cause maximum disruption, suggested this was not random vandalism. The second incident came a week later, when the pump at her main well mysteriously failed. The motor burned out in a way the repairman said looked suspicious, possibly sabotaged, leaving her without water for the house and livestock until a replacement could be installed at considerable expense. Margaret reported both incidents to the sheriff, a weary man in his late 50s named Garrett, who listened with sympathy, but made it clear that without evidence pointing to specific individuals, there was little he could do, and he carefully did not mention Thornton's name, even though both of them were thinking it. The pressure was having exactly the intended effect, draining Margaret's resources, consuming her time and energy with problems that kept her constantly reactive rather than building the life she had come here to establish. And she could feel the temptation to give in, to accept that some fights were not worth the cost, to take Thornton's money and find peace somewhere else. It was during this low point that Samuel made an unexpected gesture. He invited Margaret to witness something he had only shown Theodore once, an experience that he said might help her understand why some things were worth protecting, regardless of the cost. Hey, if you've made it this far into our story, I want to pause for just a moment to ask something. If this tale of wilderness, mystery, and unexpected connections is resonating with you, would you consider subscribing to our channel? We share stories like this regularly, narratives that explore the extraordinary hiding in the forgotten corners of our world. And here's something I'm genuinely curious about. Have you ever had a moment where you discovered something that completely changed your understanding of a place or person? Maybe you found something unexpected on your own property, or learned a secret about your hometown that made you see it differently. Drop a comment and share your story with us. I read every single one, and sometimes the best tales come from you, our community. Now, let's get back to Margaret and discover what Samuel wants to show her. Samuel led Margaret deeper into the cave system than she had been before, through passages that required crawling in places, through chambers filled with formations that glittered in the light of their headlamps, until they emerged into a cathedral-like space where the ceiling rose 40 feet above them and natural light filtered through cracks in the limestone above. The floor of the chamber was covered in sand, and in that sand were paw prints, dozens of them, generations of jaguars who had used this place for something Samuel called a nursery den. He explained that Luna was pregnant, would give birth within the next few weeks, and had chosen this chamber for raising her cubs, just as female jaguars had chosen it for decades or perhaps centuries before, drawn by the shelter and security it provided, the multiple exits that allowed escape from threats, the temperature regulation that kept cubs comfortable regardless of external weather. Samuel said that Theodore had witnessed this once, had been granted the privilege of seeing newborn cubs, an experience the old man described as one of the most profound moments of his life. And Samuel wanted Margaret to have that same experience, to understand what was at stake, to see with her own eyes why this place and these animals deserved protection against any threat. They did not have to wait long. Luna appeared at one of the smaller entrances 3 days later, her belly visibly swollen, her movements more careful than usual, and she paid no attention to Margaret and Samuel sitting motionless against the far wall, instead beginning the ancient process of preparing her den, arranging the sand with her paws, testing different locations, following instincts passed down through millennia of evolution. Margaret barely breathed, afraid to disturb this moment, watching as one of nature's most powerful predators showed the vulnerability of approaching motherhood. And when Luna finally settled into her chosen spot and looked directly at Margaret, there was something in those golden eyes that transcended species. A communication of understanding between two females facing the challenges of bringing life into an uncertain world. Samuel and Margaret left the chamber carefully, giving Luna privacy, and they maintained a respectful distance for the next 2 weeks, checking periodically but never intruding, until one morning Samuel came to the ranch house earlier than usual, his face showing rare excitement, telling Margaret that Luna had given birth during the night, that he had heard the sounds of cubs, and asking if she wanted to see. They approached the nursery chamber with extreme caution, making sure Luna knew they were coming, giving her every opportunity to signal if their presence was unwelcome. And when they reached the entrance, they could hear it clearly, the mewing cries of newborn cubs, a sound both vulnerable and insistent. Luna lay on her side in the sand, and nursing against her belly were 3 tiny cubs, their eyes still closed, their spots already visible on coats that would change as they grew, and the massive mother's attention was entirely focused on her babies, licking them clean, repositioning them to feed, making the soft chuffing sounds that Samuel said were the jaguar equivalent of maternal reassurance. Margaret felt tears on her face without realizing she was crying, overwhelmed by the intimacy of the moment, by the trust Luna was showing in allowing them to witness something so private and precious, by the raw beauty of life continuing against odds, by the responsibility she now felt to protect these vulnerable creatures, and their mother who had somehow decided that Margaret could be trusted. They stayed for only 10 minutes, not wanting to overstay their welcome, and as they left, Margaret asked Samuel how many cubs typically survived, and his answer was sobering. In the wild, maybe 50% reach adulthood, sometimes less, between disease, malnutrition, predation by other animals, and accidents. The mortality rate for jaguar cubs was heartbreakingly high. These 3 tiny lives had just begun a gauntlet of challenges, and their survival was far from guaranteed even with Luna's fierce protection. But they had a chance, and that chance existed because of the sanctuary that Theodore had maintained, and Margaret was now committed to preserving. The cubs grew rapidly over the following weeks, their eyes opening after 9 days, their coordination improving daily as they went from helpless bundles to increasingly mobile troublemakers who wanted to explore everything, despite Luna's attempts to keep them contained. Margaret visited every few days, documenting their development with photographs and notes, learning to distinguish between the 3 cubs, a male Samuel named Storm for his particularly vocal personality, another male called River for his love of playing in the shallow water that pooled in one corner of the chamber, and a female they called Echo because she had a habit of responding to any sound with her own little chirp. Watching the cubs play was both entertaining and educational. Their roughhousing was actually practice for hunting skills they would need later, their stalking of their mother's tail teaching them patience and timing, their mock fights with each other establishing dominance hierarchies and teaching them about their own strength and limits. Luna was an attentive mother but not overprotective, allowing her cubs to make mistakes and learn from them, only intervening when genuine danger threatened. And Samuel explained that this balance between protection and allowing independence was crucial for developing cubs who could survive on their own once they were old enough to leave. Margaret found herself thinking about motherhood more than she had in years. She and David had planned to have children eventually, but eventually never came. The fertility issues and the arguments about treatment options, and the growing distance between them that turned into resentment and finally indifference. And now at 31, divorced and alone on a remote ranch, the decision about children felt both more urgent and more impossible. Watching Luna with her cubs stirred something complicated inside Margaret, a mixture of longing and relief, grief for the life she had imagined and acceptance of the life she was actually living, and there was something healing about witnessing motherhood in its purest form, stripped of human complications and social expectations, just the fundamental drive to nurture and protect life. The cubs were 5 weeks old when Thornton made his next move, and this time, it was not a subtle act of sabotage, but a direct confrontation. Margaret was working on repairs to one of the outbuildings when 3 trucks pulled up to her house, Thornton in the lead vehicle, accompanied by 6 men who had the look of hired muscle rather than ranch hands. Thornton stepped out wearing that same smile that never reached his eyes, and he made a show of looking around the property, commenting on how much work needed doing, how overwhelming it must be for her, how his offer remained open and had in fact increased by 20%, given the difficulties she must be experiencing. Margaret set down her tools and walked to meet him, maintaining a calm she did not feel, and she told him directly that his offer, regardless of the amount, was not interesting to her, that the problems she had been experiencing would not change her mind, and that if he was responsible for those problems, he should know that she was documenting everything and building a case that would expose his tactics. Thornton's smile finally disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. And he said that she was making accusations she could not prove, that unfortunate things happened to all ranchers, that perhaps she should consider whether stubbornness was worth the inevitable consequences. One of his men moved toward the main house, and Margaret stepped to block his path, asking what they thought they were doing, and Thornton said they were just looking around, that he wanted to get a better sense of the property before his next offer. And Margaret knew this was about more than just valuation. They were searching for something, perhaps evidence of the jaguars, perhaps Samuel's camp, anything they could use as leverage. She pulled out her phone and called Sheriff Garrett, putting it on speaker, and when the sheriff answered, she calmly explained that Marcus Thornton and several of his associates were on her property without permission, refusing to leave, and she was requesting official assistance. Garrett's voice came through tired but firm, telling Thornton that he could hear him, and advising that he leave immediately before this became a criminal trespassing matter. And after a tense moment, Thornton gestured to his men, and they returned to their trucks. Before getting in his own vehicle, Thornton looked at Margaret and said that Theodore had made the same mistake she was making, thinking that determination and stubbornness were enough, thinking that he could hold out forever. And it was interesting that the old man's heart had given out when it did, right before Thornton was prepared to take more serious measures. The implication hung in the air like poison, the suggestion that Theodore's death might not have been entirely natural, and Margaret felt rage flood through her. But Thornton was already driving away, leaving her standing there with the sheriff's voice on the phone asking if she was all right. That evening, Margaret drove to Samuel's camp and told him everything, including Thornton's veiled suggestion about Theodore's death, and Samuel's reaction was explosive, the most emotion she had seen from him, his hands clenching and unclenching as he processed the possibility that Theodore might have been murdered. He said that Theodore had complained of chest pains in his final months, had mentioned needing to see a doctor but kept putting it off, and the medical examiner had ruled the death a natural heart attack without doing a full autopsy because Theodore was 68 and had a history of high blood pressure. But what if there had been more to it? What if Thornton had found a way to induce a heart attack, or had simply waited for the stress he was creating to do the work naturally? And Samuel's voice was raw with guilt as he said that he should have insisted Theodore get medical attention, should have recognized that the man was being pushed beyond his limits. Margaret asked if they should go to the authorities with their suspicions, but Samuel pointed out the obvious problem. They had no evidence, just speculation based on an ambiguous comment, and bringing attention to themselves and the property right now would only accelerate whatever Thornton was planning. They needed a different strategy, something that would neutralize Thornton's threat permanently while protecting the jaguars in Samuel's presence. And Margaret said she had been thinking about that, about the fact that Thornton's power came from secrecy and intimidation, from operating in shadows where his actions could not be clearly attributed to him. What if they brought light, not to the jaguars but to Thornton himself, exposing his methods so thoroughly that he would be forced to back off or face consequences that even his money and influence could not protect him from? Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret became an investigator. She spoke with other landowners Thornton had pressured, finding a pattern of tactics that was remarkably consistent: mysterious equipment failures, fence damage, problems with water rights, always just enough pressure to make continued operation difficult, but never quite enough to prove deliberate sabotage. She documented financial records showing properties acquired at far below market value after owners experienced these strings of bad luck. She found building permits that had been approved through irregular channels, inspection reports that overlooked obvious violations, evidence of corruption that extended into the county bureaucracy. She contacted a journalist from the state capitol, a woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in rural land issues, and arranged a meeting where she laid out everything she had discovered, providing documentation and connecting Patricia with other victims willing to go on record about their experiences. Patricia was skeptical at first, asking why Margaret was doing this when it would obviously paint a larger target on her back. And Margaret's answer was simple: because some things were worth the risk. Because allowing people like Thornton to operate without accountability corroded everything good about a community. Because she had promised to protect something precious, and she would not be able to do that if Thornton succeeded in taking her land. The article ran on a Sunday morning, 5 full pages detailing Thornton's empire building and the methods he used, including testimony from 7 different landowners and analysis of financial records that showed a clear pattern of predatory practices. The response was immediate and explosive. State investigators announced they would be looking into the county permit process. Federal authorities began examining whether Thornton's dealings violated anti-corruption statutes, and most importantly, the court of public opinion turned decisively against him. Thornton called Margaret 2 days after the article published, his voice tight with fury, accusing her of destroying his reputation with lies and innuendo, threatening legal action for defamation, and Margaret let him talk himself out before responding calmly that everything in the article was documented fact, that she had additional evidence she had not yet shared with journalists, and that if he came near her property or interfered with her operations in any way, she would ensure that evidence became public as well. She suggested that his best course of action would be to accept that her property was not available under any circumstances, to focus on managing his legal problems, and to leave her alone permanently, and after a long silence, Thornton hung up without another word. The cubs were 3 months old now, growing rapidly, becoming more independent, venturing out of the nursery chamber on supervised expeditions with Luna, where they learned about the larger territory that would eventually be theirs. Storm was developing into the most dominant of the 3, larger than his siblings and more aggressive in play, likely to be the one who would challenge his father Ghost when he reached maturity. River remained the most curious, the one most likely to investigate anything new, a trait that Samuel said could be either an advantage or a liability depending on what he encountered in his explorations. Echo was the smallest, but also the most coordinated, her movements already showing the fluid grace that characterized adult jaguars, and she was the one most interested in stalking practice, spending hours focused on hunting insects and small lizards that ventured into the cave system. Margaret had fallen into the habit of thinking of them almost as her own in some strange way, tracking their development with the same attention a parent might give their children's milestones, worrying when one seemed less energetic than usual, celebrating when they mastered new skills, and Samuel had noticed, commenting one afternoon that she had become invested in their survival in ways that were both beautiful and potentially heartbreaking, because the harsh reality was that not all of them would make it to adulthood regardless of how much care Luna provided or how safe their sanctuary seemed. He was right, of course, and Margaret knew it, but she also knew that caring deeply, despite the possibility of loss, was what made life meaningful, that protecting these fragile lives even with no guarantee of success was exactly the kind of thing worth building a life around, worth fighting Thornton for, worth staying in this isolated place when easier options existed. The first freeze of winter came in late November, unusual for South Texas but not unprecedented, and Margaret woke to find her water pipes frozen and the landscape transformed by a thin coating of ice that made everything strange and beautiful. She went to check on the livestock first, ensuring they had access to liquid water and shelter from the cold wind that had blown in overnight, and then she made her way to Samuel's camp, worried about how he was managing in conditions that his simple shelter was not designed for. She found him huddled near a larger fire than usual, wrapped in blankets, but he assured her he was fine, had weathered worse during his years in the wilderness, and his concern was not for himself, but for the cubs, who had never experienced cold like this and might not understand the danger of exposure. They hiked to the nursery chamber together, finding Luna and the cubs pressed together for warmth, and the mother cat's eyes showed something that might have been gratitude when Margaret and Samuel placed several wool blankets they had brought near the entrance, materials Luna could drag inside if she chose to use them. Over the next 3 days, as the cold snap persisted, Margaret brought additional supplies, straw for insulation, more blankets, high-calorie food for Luna, who was burning extra energy keeping herself and the cubs warm, and when the weather finally broke and temperatures returned to normal, all 3 cubs had survived their first serious environmental challenge. Samuel said that this was actually good for their development, that experiencing and overcoming hardship young would make them more resilient adults, better equipped to handle the unexpected. And Margaret understood he was not just talking about the jaguars, but about life in general, about how the difficulties she had faced with David and Thornton and her own isolation had made her stronger and more capable than she had been in her comfortable suburban existence. Winter settled in properly after that. Not the brutal winters of northern states, but the subtle shift that changed the character of the landscape, the grass going dormant, the mesquite trees losing their leaves, the animals adapting to shorter days and longer nights. Margaret found rhythms in the work, the daily tasks of maintaining the ranch, the regular visits to Samuel's camp, the hours spent observing the jaguars as they adapted to the cooling weather, and she realized with some surprise that she was happy, genuinely happy in a way she had not been for years. The property that had seemed like a desperate escape 6 months ago had become home. The isolation that had felt oppressive had become treasured solitude, and the strangeness of her arrangement with Samuel and the secret jaguar population had become the center point around which her new life organized itself. On Christmas Eve, Margaret brought a proper meal to Samuel's camp: roasted chicken and vegetables, fresh bread, even a small bottle of whiskey, and they sat by the fire as darkness fell, talking about their lives before this place, sharing stories they had not told before. Samuel spoke about his marriage that had fallen apart after their daughter died in a car accident, the way grief had poisoned everything between him and his wife, until they could not stand to be in the same room, the way he had eventually run from the ruins of that life, seeking oblivion or peace, he was not sure which. Margaret told him about David and the fertility struggles, the growing distance, the casual cruelty of watching him start a new family so quickly with someone else, the feeling of being erased from the life she had helped build, and they sat in comfortable silence after that. Two broken people who had found a strange sanctuary together. Not romance. Margaret understood that was not what this was, but something equally valuable: partnership and understanding and shared purpose. Luna appeared at the edge of the firelight, the cubs trailing behind her, larger now but still obviously young, still possessing that clumsy enthusiasm that characterized juvenile animals. And Samuel made his clicking sound while Margaret remained perfectly still, and Luna approached closer than she ever had before, the cubs following their mother's lead, and for 10 minutes they were surrounded by jaguars, by wild predators who had chosen trust over fear, and Margaret thought that if she died tomorrow, this moment would be enough, this perfect intersection of human and wild, this privilege that so few people would ever experience. The cubs were 6 months old when tragedy struck. River, the curious one, ventured too far from Luna during a hunting lesson and encountered a feral hog, an aggressive boar that attacked without warning, and by the time Luna responded to his distress calls, the damage was done. Samuel found them the next morning, Luna and her remaining cubs near River's body, the mother cat pacing and vocalizing her grief in sounds that carried across the entire territory. And Samuel came to get Margaret immediately, his face showing the devastation he felt. They buried River in the cave system, in a chamber where the limestone formations created natural cathedral, and Samuel spoke words over the small grave, acknowledging a life that had been brief but had mattered, had brought joy and wonder to those privileged to witness it. And Margaret cried openly, grieving not just for the cub, but for all the loss she had experienced, for the children she never had, for the marriage that failed, for Theodore, who she never really got to know, for every broken thing that could not be fixed. But Storm and Echo survived, grew stronger, learned from their brother's death to be more cautious, more aware of threats beyond their immediate perception, and over the following months, they transformed from cubs into young adults, their spots changing pattern, their bodies elongating and filling out with muscle, their play becoming more serious, more clearly practiced for survival skills they would need when they eventually left Luna's territory to seek their own. Samuel said that their dispersal would likely happen around 18 months, that Luna would begin pushing them away, encouraging independence, following the ancient pattern that ensured genetic diversity and prevented overcrowding of territory. And when that time came, Storm would probably head north or west, seeking territory unclaimed by established males, while Echo might remain closer, potentially finding space within the larger area that her mother controlled. The thought of them leaving made Margaret sad, but she understood it was necessary, understood that successful parenting, whether jaguar or human, meant preparing offspring to survive without you, meant accepting that your role was temporary, even though your love was permanent. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Several conservation organizations reached out to Margaret after hearing rumors about wildlife on her property, wanting to conduct surveys, wanting to establish monitoring programs. And Margaret had to carefully deflect their interest without arousing suspicion about what she was protecting. She allowed limited access to portions of the property far from Samuel's camp and the jaguar territory, permitted some camera-trapping studies that she could control, created the appearance of cooperation while maintaining the secrecy that was essential for protecting the cats. One researcher, a graduate student named Thomas Wu, who was studying ocelot populations in South Texas, proved more persistent than the others, and Margaret eventually allowed him access to the southwestern section under careful supervision, curious to see how he would react if he discovered signs of the larger cats. But Thomas was focused entirely on his ocelots, missing the jaguar evidence that was obvious to Margaret's now trained eyes, and she realized that people often only found what they were looking for, that the jaguars remained hidden in plain sight, because most people had decided they could not possibly exist here. Storm and Echo were 16 months old when Ghost died. The massive male had been growing more aggressive as he aged, taking risks he might have avoided in his prime. And he made the fatal mistake of challenging a black bear that had wandered into the territory, a confrontation that left both animals mortally wounded. Samuel found Ghost's body first, guided by the circling vultures, and the great cat's death marked a fundamental shift in the territory dynamics. Storm, now nearly full-grown and without his father's presence to suppress his instincts, began marking territory aggressively, claiming the space that Ghost had controlled. And within a month, he had effectively driven Smoke, the younger male who had never quite established dominance, out of the area entirely. Luna accepted her son's new role with apparent indifference, the territorial boundaries between them clear and respected, and Echo remained in an intermediate space, not quite independent, but no longer requiring her mother's constant presence, learning the final skills she would need for complete autonomy. Margaret watched these changes with fascination and sadness, understanding that she was witnessing the natural cycle, death creating space for new life, young animals replacing old, the territory passing to the next generation, and she thought about her own place in these cycles, wondered what she was building here that might outlast her, what legacy she might leave. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Patricia Chen, the journalist who had exposed Thornton's activities, contacted Margaret with a proposal. She wanted to write a book about disappearing rural America, about people who chose isolation and hard work over the easier paths offered by modern society, and she wanted Margaret's story to be one of the chapters. The young widow who inherited a ranch and chose to stay despite every rational reason to leave. Margaret's first instinct was to refuse, to protect her privacy and the secrets she guarded, but Patricia assured her that she could maintain anonymity, that details would be changed to protect her identity, and Margaret began to see the opportunity differently, a chance to tell a story about why places like this mattered, about what was lost when remaining wilderness was consumed by development, about the human need for connection with something beyond our own species. She agreed with strict conditions about what could and could not be revealed, and over the following months, Patricia visited regularly, interviewing Margaret about her experiences, documenting her daily life, capturing the essence of what it meant to choose this particular hardship. And through those conversations, Margaret came to understand her own journey more clearly, came to articulate why she stayed, why she fought Thornton, why she protected Samuel and the jaguars with such fierce determination. The book, when it was finally published 18 months later, became an unexpected success. Not a bestseller, but a steady presence that found its audience, people who felt disconnected from nature, who longed for simpler lives, who wondered if there were alternatives to the paths society insisted were the only options. And Margaret received letters, dozens, then hundreds, from readers who said her story had inspired them to make changes, to seek their own versions of meaningful isolation, to fight for what they believed in despite the costs. Thornton's legal problems eventually resulted in convictions for fraud and corruption, a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, the dissolution of his ranch empire as properties were sold to satisfy judgments and legal fees, and Margaret felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that the threat was finally, definitively over. She bought 3 of his former properties at auction, expanding her own holdings to nearly 6,000 acres, creating a genuine sanctuary for the jaguars, ensuring they would have space to thrive for generations. And she hired a conservation lawyer to establish a trust that would protect the land in perpetuity, ensuring that even after her death, the territory would remain wild and undeveloped. Samuel grew older, his hair going more gray, his movements slightly slower, but he showed no interest in leaving, telling Margaret that he had found his place in the world and had no desire to search for another, and they established a deeper friendship built on thousands of hours of shared experience. Conversations that could communicate volumes with a few words or comfortable silences. A partnership that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with mutual respect and shared purpose. Storm fathered his first litter when he was 3 years old, cubs with a young female who had dispersed from territory to the south, and Margaret and Samuel watched the new generation with the same wonder and concern they had felt for Luna's cubs years before, understanding that the cycle was continuing, that their protection had enabled something precious to persist. Echo remained in the territory, eventually establishing her own smaller range adjacent to her mother's, and Luna, now 10 years old and past her prime for breeding, seemed content to share space with her daughter, the 2 females occasionally hunting together, maintaining bonds that defied the usual pattern of complete independence. Margaret was 38 when she finally allowed herself to acknowledge that she had built a life that satisfied her in ways her old existence never had, that the loneliness she initially fled to this place to escape had transformed into chosen solitude, that the emptiness left by childlessness had been filled by different forms of nurturing and protection. And when people asked if she was happy, she could answer honestly that yes, she was, in ways that were complicated and hard to explain, but absolutely real. The ranch prospered under her management. She had learned from Theodore's journals and from her own mistakes, had developed methods that worked with the harsh land rather than against it, and while she would never be wealthy, she was successful enough, sustainable enough, and the work gave her purpose beyond mere survival. Margaret was standing on her porch one evening in late summer, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and crimson, when she saw a figure walking up the dirt road toward her house. It had been 5 years since Samuel first brought anyone else to the property, and her stomach tightened with concern until she recognized the gait and build as Thomas Wu, the ocelot researcher who had worked briefly on her land years ago. He reached the porch, looking dusty and excited, and before she could ask what brought him back, he pulled out a camera and showed her a photograph that made her blood run cold. A clear image of Storm in full daylight. Unmistakably a jaguar. Unmistakably on her property. Thomas was nearly vibrating with excitement, talking rapidly about what an incredible discovery this was, how everyone thought jaguars were gone from this region, how this could change conservation priorities for the entire state, and Margaret forced herself to remain calm, to think clearly despite the panic rising in her chest. She told Thomas that she needed to see the exact location where he took the photograph, that she wanted to understand the full context before they did anything with this information, and Thomas agreed enthusiastically, saying he had more camera traps set up and wanted to check them all, that there might be evidence of a breeding population, and Margaret knew she had to control this situation quickly before it spiraled beyond her ability to manage. She convinced Thomas to come back the next morning for a comprehensive tour of where he had been working, giving herself time to talk with Samuel, and after Thomas left, she drove to the camp faster than was safe on the rough terrain, arriving breathless and worried. Samuel took the news with surprising calm, saying he had known this moment would eventually come, that secrets this big could not be kept forever, and he asked Margaret what she wanted to do, whether she wanted to protect the secret at all costs, or whether perhaps it was time for a different approach. They talked through the night, weighing options, considering consequences, and by dawn, they had reached a decision that felt both terrifying and right. They would control the revelation, working with conservationists and authorities they trusted to establish formal protection for the jaguars, while maintaining the essential sanctuary, working to ensure that increased attention did not destroy what they had spent years building. When Thomas returned the next morning, Margaret told him everything, or at least a carefully edited version of everything, about the jaguar population that had quietly re-established itself, about her efforts to protect them while respecting their wild nature, about the need for any conservation effort to prioritize the animals' well-being over human curiosity or scientific ambition. Thomas listened with growing amazement, asking questions that showed both his professional interest and his understanding of the delicate balance required. And when Margaret finished, he said something that surprised her. He asked what she needed from him, how he could help protect what she had been guarding, rather than immediately thinking about his own research opportunities or career advancement. Over the following months, they built a coalition carefully, bringing in conservationists with proven track records of prioritizing wildlife over publicity, working with federal authorities to establish formal endangered species protections without triggering the kind of attention that would turn the ranch into a spectacle, creating a management plan that maintained the essential isolation and security the jaguars needed while acknowledging their existence officially. It was complicated and exhausting, countless meetings and negotiations, lawyers and bureaucrats and scientists all needing to be satisfied, but Margaret persisted, refusing to accept any arrangement that compromised the fundamentals of what she and Theodore and Samuel had built. The official designation came through on a cold day in January. Margaret's ranch and the surrounding purchased properties were declared critical habitat for an endangered species, protected under federal law, with management oversight remaining largely in her hands as the primary landowner and the person with most knowledge of the population. The announcement made regional news but was deliberately downplayed to minimize public interest, and the exact location of the core territory was kept confidential, marked only as somewhere in a 3-county region. Samuel met with officials exactly once, providing testimony about his observations while maintaining firm boundaries about his own presence on the land, and the authorities chose not to press the issue of his status, recognizing that his knowledge was valuable and his impact on the jaguar population had been positive, deciding that some irregularities were acceptable in service of larger conservation goals. Margaret was 42 when she finally took a day off from the constant pressure of managing the ranch and the protection effort, driving alone to the nursery chamber where she had first seen Luna's cubs all those years ago. The cave was empty now. Luna had died the previous winter at the remarkable age of 13, ancient for a wild jaguar, and her daughter Echo had moved into new territory, but the space still felt sacred somehow, still carried the weight of all that had happened there. Margaret sat in the sand where Luna had nursed her cubs, where she had witnessed the intimate moments of wild motherhood, where she had learned that love and loss were inseparable, that protection and vulnerability existed in constant tension, that the privilege of caring deeply came with the certainty of eventual grief, and she cried for everything she had lost and everything she had found, for Theodore, who started this before she arrived, for Samuel, who had taught her to see differently, for River, who died too young, for Luna, who had somehow trusted them, for her own broken marriage and empty womb and all the children she would never have, and for the strange, unlikely family she had built from fragments and intention. When the tears stopped, she felt lighter somehow, cleansed by the acknowledgement of pain, and she made a promise to the empty cave, to the memory of the animals who had used it, to the land itself, that she would continue the work, would protect what needed protecting, would make the hard choices that preservation required for as long as she was able. She found Samuel at his camp, older now but still vital, still committed to his chosen life, and they sat by the fire as they had done hundreds of times before, and she told him about her cave visit, her breakdown and her resolution, and Samuel nodded his understanding, saying that this land had a way of breaking people open, of forcing them to confront what they had been avoiding, but that the breaking was often necessary for the healing that followed. Storm appeared at the edge of the firelight, now 6 years old and in his absolute prime, a massive male weighing over 200 pounds, and he looked at them with Luna's golden eyes, carrying forward her legacy, and Margaret understood with sudden clarity that this was what legacy actually meant, not leaving behind monuments or institutions bearing your name, but enabling life to continue, creating space for the next generation to thrive, protecting the conditions that made survival possible. The book Patricia wrote had led to others, filmmakers wanting to document Margaret's work, conservationists wanting to study her methods, people wanting to turn her story into something larger than it was, and she had refused most of them, accepting only projects that served the primary goal of protection, maintaining the essential privacy and isolation even as the jaguar's existence became officially acknowledged. She trained younger people, gradually building a small team that could help with the expanded territory management, carefully vetting each person, ensuring they understood that the work was about service rather than glory, about showing up day after day for unglamorous tasks, about accepting that the animal's needs superseded human convenience. Margaret was 46 when the heart attack came, sudden and massive, dropping her in the barn while she was checking on a sick horse. And if the young ranch hand Miguel had not found her quickly, she would have died there. Instead, she woke in a hospital 3 days later, tubes and monitors surrounding her, doctors explaining the damage to her heart, the need for surgery, the likelihood that her physical capability would be permanently reduced, and her first thought, even through the fog of medication, was about who would protect the jaguars if she could not. The recovery was long and frustrating, weeks in the hospital followed by months of limited activity, and Samuel visited her regularly, making the long drive to San Antonio despite his discomfort with cities, sitting beside her bed, telling stories about the jaguars, about new cubs that had been born, about territory disputes and successful hunts, keeping her connected to the place that had become her life. When she finally returned to the ranch, Margaret had to accept new limitations. She could not do the physical labor she once had, could not make the long hikes to Samuel's camp, could not push through exhaustion the way she used to, and it was humbling and hard, forcing her to delegate, to trust others with responsibilities she had always kept for herself, to acknowledge that she was not invincible. But limitations also brought unexpected gifts, more time to observe rather than constantly do, opportunities to document what she knew before it was lost, hours spent writing detailed accounts of jaguar behavior and territory management, creating resources for those who would continue the work after she was gone, and she found satisfaction in this different form of contribution, less immediate, but perhaps longer lasting. Echo had her second litter that spring, 3 healthy cubs that carried Storm's genetics, the family connections growing more complex, creating a network of relationships that spanned the entire protected territory. And Margaret watched through photographs and Samuel's descriptions, unable to see them directly, but still connected, still invested in their survival. She was 49 when Samuel died, peacefully in his sleep, found by one of the young ranch hands who had gone to check on him after he missed 2 supply pickups. They buried him in the cave system as he had requested, in the same chamber where they had buried River years before, and Margaret spoke words over his grave about friendship and dedication, about a man who had found redemption through protection, about partnership that transcended conventional relationships, and she felt his loss as deeply as if he had been blood family, because in all the ways that mattered, he was. The young people she had trained stepped up, continuing Samuel's observations, maintaining the relationship with the jaguars that he had built, and Margaret coordinated from the ranch house, her reduced mobility preventing direct involvement, but her knowledge and experience guiding the overall effort, and she understood that this too was a form of legacy, the ability to step back and trust others to carry forward what you started. Margaret was 53 when the documentary filmmaker convinced her to participate in a project about jaguar conservation, arguing that her story, properly told, could inspire support for similar efforts elsewhere, could show that coexistence between humans and large predators was possible with the right approach and commitment. She agreed reluctantly, demanding editorial control over how the jaguars were portrayed, ensuring that nothing in the film would compromise their safety or turn the ranch into a tourist destination, and the resulting documentary was subtle and powerful, focusing more on the daily work and difficult choices than on dramatic wildlife footage, and it found its audience among people serious about conservation rather than those seeking entertainment. The attention brought new challenges and new opportunities, funding for expanded protection, political support for similar efforts in other regions, and also increased scrutiny, people questioning Margaret's methods, arguing that the jaguars should be more accessible for scientific study, demanding that she open the property to researchers, and she held her ground firmly, explaining that her primary obligation was to the animals, that their well-being superseded human curiosity, that the very isolation people wanted to violate was essential to the population's survival. Storm died at 9 years old, killed by a younger male challenging for territory, the natural cycle repeating, and Margaret grieved for him as she had grieved for Luna and River and Samuel, understanding that death was as much a part of this work as life, that protection could not mean preventing all loss, only ensuring that loss served the larger continuity rather than ending it. Echo remained, now 13 years old like her mother had been, slowing down but still present, still raising cubs when she could, still holding territory with the fierce determination that characterized her species, and Margaret thought often about the parallels between them, two females who had built lives around protection and persistence, who had survived longer than seemed likely, who had seen so much change while maintaining essential commitments. Margaret was 58 when she updated her will for the final time, ensuring that the ranch and the conservation trust would continue properly after her death, that the protections would remain in place, that the work would not end when she did, and making these arrangements felt both sobering and satisfying, like completing a task that had taken her entire adult life. She spent her mornings writing now, documenting everything she had learned, creating detailed accounts that would help future managers understand not just what to do, but why, explaining the philosophy that had guided her decisions, the ethics that had shaped her approach. And these writings became her final contribution, the crystallization of decades of experience into something that could outlive her body's limitations. The ranch was quiet on the evening Margaret died, a peaceful autumn sunset painting the western sky, and she sat on her porch as she had done thousands of times before, looking out across the land she had protected, thinking about Theodore and Samuel and Luna and all the others who had shared this strange journey. And when the second heart attack came, it was quick, taking her between one breath and the next, and she died as she had lived, looking at the wilderness she loved, knowing that her work would continue, that the jaguars would persist, that something precious had been preserved through her determination and sacrifice. If you've traveled this far with Margaret's incredible story, I want to thank you sincerely for being part of our community here. Stories like this one remind us that there are still places in our world where the extraordinary can exist if we're willing to fight for it, where commitment and courage can preserve something precious against overwhelming odds. If Margaret's journey resonated with you, if it made you think differently about what's worth protecting or what kind of life you want to build, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel. We're building something special here, a community of people who believe that these stories matter, that there's value in exploring the unexpected corners of human experience. And I have a question for you. What would you protect if you could? What would you dedicate your life to preserving, regardless of the cost or the isolation it might require? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about the things you care about deeply enough to make sacrifices for. Sometimes the most powerful stories come from the community, from people sharing their own experiences with passion and dedication. Your story might inspire someone else the way Margaret's story might have inspired you. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and remember that every like, every share, every comment helps us reach more people who need to hear these tales of determination and hope. Until next time, keep seeking the extraordinary in the ordinary, and keep fighting for what matters to you.